Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this EPP press conference on something that I dare saying is the most important legislation in the current mandate, the so-called Fit for 55 climate package. As you know, 8 of these files will be voted in the Parliament today. Unfortunately, we had some change, a change to the program. The Vice President, Esther de Lange, cannot yet be with us because the negotiations of some parts of the package are still ongoing. And since she's overseeing this for the group, she is still there. But I have here with me 2 spokesmen, Peter Liese, the spokesman of the group in the Environment Committee, and Christian Ehler, spokesman of the group in the Industry Committee. And how this is going to play out is the following. We will give the word to Mr. Liese for an introductory remarks, and then we will proceed immediately with your questions. Mr. Liese, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, and good morning, everybody. Happy to see so many people in the room, and I know that even more are online. In fact, climate change is the biggest challenge of our politician generation. We saw the floods last year in Central Europe. We see the heat waves in Southern Europe every year, and we need to act, and we need to act faster to save the planet for our children and grandchildren. The crisis with the Ukraine, we think, forces us to adapt the strategy, but not to give it up. We want to achieve our 2030 targets, and in some occasions, Christian can elaborate more on it. For example, in renewables, we are even increasing ambition. Today, we are voting on 8 reports. 7 of them are politically important. In 4 cases, the EPP has the rapporteurship. And those reports, of course, we like more because our rapporteurs, we think, worked more inclusive. They had a broad majority in committee. But even those ones, the 4 reports, ETS, aviation, social climate fund, and now I'm stuck. Social climate fund, ETS, aviation, and effort sharing. Sorry, it's too much also for me. We will even improve in the vote in plenary today, I'm quite sure. In 3 other occasions, the EPP couldn't support the report at committee level. That is carbon border adjustment by Mohammed Chaim, CO2 cars by Jan Huitema, and LULUCF by Ville Niisto, the Green rapporteur from Finland. We hope we can support them today in plenary because we have some key votes, and we are quite optimistic that we will win these key votes. On the reports that we already liked, we would like even more, is, for example, the Social Climate Fund. Esther de Lange and David Casa, the EPP rapporteurs, did a very good job. One key message for us is we want to help people to get out of energy poverty forever. So we don't want to pay them a check once, and they have an ease with the high energy prices once, but we want them to use modern technology to reduce their energy consumption. Then we will help them for many, many years, and that was a priority which we safeguarded. The overall package is very, very ambitious. Please don't be misled by people that say it's not ambitious. In the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, we reduced the emissions by 25%. That's more than any other big economy in the world. But now we are doing 30% in only 8 years. So 4 times more each year. Can you say this is not ambitious? If you quadruple your efforts per year, those of you that are here for a bit longer time know that climate policy was never easy, and it will not be easy in the future. I'm rapporteur for the ETS, and I'm quite happy that we have a broad consensus on most of the issues. EPP had, of course, like all the other groups, controversial debates, but I'm happy to say that ETS2, the ETS for road transport and buildings, is alive and kicking. ETS will be supported by EPP, and as far as I see, by a huge majority in the European Parliament, including ETS2. I made a compromise already at committee level to, for the moment, exclude private buildings and private transport. And this gives a lot of responsibility to the member states because they still have their targets on the effort sharing. And we will carefully look if they really do this job. We agreed to the bonus-malus system to help those innovative companies that are front runners to reward innovation in industry. And we agreed as an EPP to include maritime in the ETS from 2024. Last point, and Christian will elaborate more on this, the controversial point in the debate today, except CO2 cars, will be that we want an even distribution of the efforts until 2030. So don't believe people that say EPP wants less ambition. We want to achieve the 2030 target, and our amendment together with Renew even overachieves the necessary target for 2030. We add 2%. But we don't want a one-off reduction in 24 because we have a problem. We need to replace Russian gas. And in the time when we will need to replace Russian gas, partially by coal, to do more than in the other years, that's a contradiction. And that's why I ask you not to say EPP is watering down the proposal, but we are avoiding a price shock, a one-off reduction in a time of crisis, and we want to do just every year the same effort. And that's not wrong, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to open now the floor for questions. Just to... Mr. Ehler, go ahead if you would like to make a short introductory statement as well.
No, I just want to reflect a little bit what Peter had been saying. I mean, we're at the dawn of a recession in Europe. Italy already declared recession. So what we are doing is now we are adopting the Fit for 55 proposal to reality. And that is not just to give the industry an ease. I think the good news is the industry is on its way. Whatever we decide today, the industry is on its way. But what we have to understand is investment cycles. We have to understand the liquidity in the markets. And what we are going to see is the decisive years are 23 and 24. That's the years where industry, entrepreneurs, small businesses have to make their decisions and have to make their investments in order to achieve 2030. So the crucial years are 23 and 24. And we're in a time of rising energy prices, rising raw material prices. We have shaky markets. We are up from the recession. And in these crucial 2 years, we want to do the investments. And all what we want is that we keep the ambition for 2030, but we give industry the ease in these crucial 2 years for the decision-making process and for the investment process, that we don't take the liquidity out of the market. I just give you one example and then I stop. If you're a steel company, you have to decide at average about €1 billion if you want to take combustion, out of combustion carbon. So if you want to substitute that by hydrogen, that costs you roughly on a side €1 billion. In the same year, when you invest the €1 billion in 24, you pay the equivalent of another €1 billion for ETS. And that doesn't economically make sense. Because yes, they have to pay because they're still polluting, but in the year of the decision making to ask them to invest $1 billion, but at the same time to take away $1 billion from them in that critical economic situation doesn't make sense. So to have an idea how to stretch that by keeping the ambition, that is what we want. And I think that's very plausible. Otherwise, we might fail with our ambition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an online event, so there are journalists present also remotely. in fact, I would now like to ask whether there are questions in the room. Yes, I see Angelo in the last row. Please introduce yourself and tell which media you're working for before you ask a question.
Yes, thanks. Angelo Di Mambro, ANSA, Italian News Agency. The EPP is tabling an amendment for a regulatory moratorium. Could you please clarify what are the regulations you have in mind? I mean, there is still a part of the Fit for 55 that should be explored by the European Parliament. There is all the part on food and pesticides that has to be proposed by the Commission, is expected to be proposed by the Commission. What are the regulations you have in mind when you propose this moratorium? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Ehler.
So first of all, if you have a closer look, this is the report of the Industry Committee. So it's a joint effort for the Industry Committee. It's not just EPP, because we have an industry policy report in parallel to Fit for 55. And secondly, the idea is not to blindly to put a finger on a specific regulation. We're asking the Commission to do an analysis in the light of what we want to achieve to 2030, where they can give an ease or would grant a moratorium for industry. I give you an example, but I don't want to have the discussion on that example because we are not pointing our finger to a specific legislation. But if you look to the chemical industry, they will need most likely 8 to 10 times more energy in the next few years if they really want to take carbon out of combustion. So that might be of transformative nature. That might be the industry which is affected the most. So now in the drawers of the Commission, there's a REACH 2. That's a regulation which would affect roughly 12,000 products. So when we, at the same time, when we expect from that industry to transform dramatically, and in practical terms to raise their prices for their products, that we put an umbrella regulation on them, which gives additional burden to that industry. It's very plausible, not that this industry that we are putting too much burden, it's simply plausible that they're crowding out, that they're going to produce in other parts of the world because they can't manage. So that is the idea, but the idea is not to say we don't want to have a REACH or we don't want to have a specific legislation. We are asking for the Commission for an analysis on the sectors based on what Breton had been presenting as the 17 ecosystems, so the 17 sectors of European industry, and look to the specifics of that eco-sectors, pretty much saying, is there a possibility to say we have a moratorium for a few years on additional legislation? Is it plausible or not? So we are not fighting, and that's important also between us, we don't fighting environmental legislation. We're simply asking for precise analysis, as Breton had been announcing when he had been presenting the ecosystems, whether in these ecosystems it fits that we put additional burden on the industry and what would that make in combination with Fit for 55. And I think that's a proper proposal, but it's not a fight of the Industry Committee or EPP against environmental legislation. That might be also additional regulatory burden, that might cover a lot of things, but we need an analysis of that because the ecosystems hadn't been formulated properly. We're still waiting that the Commission is describing what they see as needed in the individual sectors to fulfill Fit for 55. And I think it's a proper proposal, and I think it's very important to understand that we now have to focus. If we shoot in every direction, we're going to fail with Fit for 55.
Thank you. We have other questions. I saw John.
John Ainger, Bloomberg. Thanks very much. I've got a couple of questions on the ETS. Do you expect Parliament today to back any kind of carbon market restrictions today, and which ones are those likely to be? I believe there's a couple of amendments on the table. And secondly, a question on ambition and rebasing. As I understand it, your amendment says that the first tranche of rebasing will take place a year after entry of force of the regulation. Does that mean entry into force in 2024 so that rebasing can take place in 2025? Thank you.
This was a question from Mr. Liese.
Could we group some questions so that more?
I think let's continue this way. I think it's right.
Yeah, thank you very much for asking on the ETS. I distributed also this graph. The reporting was mainly on CO2 cars, at least in Germany. But when you look at the emissions that are saved by the ETS, it's 25 times more than from CO2 cars. CO2 cars is very symbolic, but we believe in the market. We believe in a market-based system, and we see that ETS is really the game changer. The big bulk of the efforts will be done by the ETS. In fact, it's 1.5 million tons of emissions and only 60 million by CO2 cars. On your questions, there will be an amendment on market restrictions because the two biggest groups have amendments, and if our amendment from EPP doesn't pass, we have a plus in the voting list for the S&D amendment, so definitely that will pass. On the rebasing, our amendment, together with Renew, foresees the rebasing in 24 as the Commission proposal, but a limited one, not 120 million or not more than 200 million then from the ENVI committee. That is what we are fighting very hard because it's bringing much more efforts in a time when investment is needed and we need to replace Russian gas. And renewables, you know, we just have a debate in Germany how to increase wind power. Nobody believes, also not our Green Climate Minister, that we in 2024 have 2 times more wind power than today. It needs time, and 2030 we need to be there, but not 2024. That's why to have more ambition in 24 than in the rest of the years is really not what we want. So that's why less one-off reduction, less rebasing. We even suggested 0, but the compromise with Renew is 70.
Thank you. There was a question over there.
Thank you. Peter Thompson, Watch Media. 2 questions for Mr. Liese. One on clarification just regarding cars and another on the ETS. Regarding the ETS, recently a compromise proposal in Council has addressed the need for a buffer zone of 300 nautical miles in order to avoid carbon leakage. Maybe a bit off subject. It's just whether or not that is something that you would like to see as rapporteur. And regarding the clarification, you mentioned this need that we shouldn't say that the EPP is watering down these ambitions. Just to be clear, when you say 2030 targets, it's the 75% for personal transport and the 70% for vans. Yes? Thank you.
Sorry, I think it's open, yeah? Okay. On the 2020-30 target for cars and vans, it's 55%. And that is agreed in ENVI committee, and that will get the support of the EPP. On maritime and carbon leakage, yes, it's very important that we include maritime in the ETS. Ships are potentially the most environmental friendly mode of transport, but the technology is old-fashioned. They are burning the stuff that others don't use. We need to make them to burn clean fuels and bring innovation to the shipping and to the ports. But we want to avoid carbon leakage, and that's why this proposal that is discussed in the Council is also part of our compromises. There is an amendment signed by EPP and S&D on this, and I'm sure it will get the majority today. So we don't want European ports to be suffering from the climate legislation, but to encourage third countries to do the same. When I was in Glasgow last year, it was one of my most important points that the world needs to act on maritime, and carbon leakage must be avoided also here.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Ieder de Vries from Ieder News from the Netherlands. I want a clarification on your opposition in general for the companies. You want to postpone some decisions for a few years, and you have come with an own amendment about the cars. You are opposing the report of Houtema, I understand. Are there two different things, or is that the same because you want to postpone, you want to delay it?
I said several times that we don't want to delay this. Can you please explain your narrative? Why do you think we want to postpone? Can you explain the amendment signed by EPP that does this?
Because of your clarification in the beginning, that you said that the two major years were 22 and 23, or 23 and 24, because you don't want to peak too early, you want to spread it a little.
Yeah. So just to be
and there is a report of Houtema who says, stop immediately with the cars, and that doesn't go together.
Yeah, but first of all, Houtema doesn't say immediately. 35 is not immediately. But I will come to that. The very important point, this ETS reform will be bringing a lot of ambition, also in 24 already. So the linear reduction factor will increase. The ambition for industry will be really, really tough. But what we want is that in 24, we don't do even more than in 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. So the amendment of EPP and Renew would just avoid that in 2024, the big bulk of the efforts that we need until 2030 is already done in 2024. So can somebody in the room give me an explanation why to act in 2024 much, much more than in 25, 27, 28, when windmills are not mature, we are dependent from Russian gas. So there is a curve that we support. Every year, less ambition. And the ENVI committee says in 25 and 24, much more ambition, and then smaller steps. So I don't think that's really logical, but I admit that it's complicated, and sometimes you have to put things easy, but it is not that we are watering down the ambition overall, and we just want a more even distribution and no one-off price shock in 24. On the cars, we want technology neutrality. We don't think that politicians should decide if the electric vehicle or synthetic fuels are the best choice. I personally believe that most consumers will buy an electrical car if we give them the necessary infrastructure, and that's what we need to do. Most car manufacturers are going for electric vehicles. But do you know this? We know in 2035 if that is really the best cost-efficient measure to achieve our climate neutrality target, or if the synthetic fuels are developing in such a pace. You know, we have seen it in solar modules. Would you have told me 15 years ago that solar energy is more efficient, more cheap than coal and nuclear? I wouldn't believe, but it is the way it works. And that's why technological developments cannot be predicted, and politicians shouldn't regulate technology. They should regulate the target.
Perhaps if I may add, we have an export-driven car manufacturing industry. And I'm the chair of the think tank of the European Parliament, and this is really bipartisan. And we don't have any study or any projection from any international organization that there's a chance that Africa and parts of Asia are going to have an infrastructure which make e-mobility available. It's very likely that in Africa, for example, the production of synthetic fuels due to the sun and their potential to produce them is a much more likely answer to individual transport. And since we have an expert industry, I think it is a very self-centered perception that the European solution is the solution of the rest of the world. But we are the car manufacturer of the rest of the world. And what we're going to see is that the Chinese and other parts of Asia are now focusing on our export markets because they do know that the infrastructure question is not solved in Africa and other parts of the world, and they might have, due to their potentials with renewables and their potentials to produce much cheaper synthetic fuels, they might see that as the solution. And the question is simply whether we cut completely the potential of the car industry for foreign markets or not. And that's not an effort to pollute anymore. It's simply that it should stay technology open in order not to mess up the potential of one of the biggest employers in Europe. And I think that's the rationale behind that. We're not wanting to prolong the combustion engines in Europe. That's not the case, but we don't want to die down or to kill the technology ambitions and the technology potential of our car industry for other markets.
Thank you very much. We have time for a very short last question. We have 2 minutes left, so please be precise.
Hello, my name is Matthijs Schiffers, Het Financiële Dagblad. Where are we now on phasing out free allowances under ETS and CBAM? Thanks.
We will have a controversial vote on the phasing out of free allowances and phasing in of CBAM. EPP supports the ITRE line, which had broad support in ITRE, not only EPP, but also Renew and S&D, phasing out from 28 to 2034. And the committee voted for 25 to 2030, so very fast. The problem is that we don't know if CBAM works. And if we kill the free allowances, which protected industry from carbon leakage, and you know, the world is changing anyhow. This package is so tough that every company that doesn't invest will be short of allowances. If we take away them without having the protection really working, we see a danger. That's why we support the ITRE line. The ENVI line will not fly. It will not have a majority. The decision is between the Renew and S&D compromise, which is 26 to 23, or the ITRE proposal, which is 28 to 34. So this will be a very tough, narrow vote.
Thank you, Mr. Ehler. A final word?
Perhaps to add to CBAM, I mean, it's a fairly academic discussions right now whether CBAM is going to work. We have seen that under the Trump administration, where we have safeguards for the steel industry, we couldn't do that because the Americans went, although there was WTO conformity of the safeguard measure for the steel markets, the Americans simply came up with a proposal of the 1960s saying that steel is a matter of national security. That's the famous Section 232. And all of a sudden we were exactly on an issue like that, so preventing that the European market is running full of cheaply produced steel, having an instrument, a safeguard instrument, but it didn't work. We were all of a sudden in an arbitrary process with Mr. Trump because he had been interpreting that differently. So what we fear is not so much that we are pretty much saying, okay, CBAM is not going to work. We simply say, I think it is very plausible also to find acceptance for CBAM, that we don't expose us in the first year when we introduce CBAM and where we have to see whether our trading partners are going to accept that, whether that goes to the court of WTO, and have a phase where we're not totally dependent on CBAM, because we might be simply in a situation that we had been exposing us so much that in an arbitrary situation, we're in a very weak situation to negotiate. So I think this safety year is very plausible, not just because we question CBAM. We are in favor of CBAM, but we should be aware that 3 years ago, we directly got in this arbitrary situation with the Americans and we lost. So if we have exposed us completely or our industry, and CBAM is to be negotiated with trading partners, but we are in a situation that we had been dramatically weak in our industry, although CBAM is not working, that is not very plausible even to fulfill or to get CBAM accepted with our trading partners. So to have a little bit of breathing space for the industry makes it even more plausible that we get CBAM through than exposing us completely and then being all of a sudden in an arbitrary situation as we had been with the Americans on steel. Thank you.
Maybe just one last sentence from my side. The things are very complicated, and that's why I offer to explain the result of the vote in a video conference at 2:30 after the votes, I will explain what has been adopted, what has not been adopted. I hope then we can clarify also other things in this very complicated vote.
Thank you to both of the speakers. Thanks for the questions.